Welcome back to the third piece on blood and soil and cars. So here we'll discuss the idea of blood and soil, blood referring to the goal of a racially pure Aryan people, and soil invoked in Nazi Germany, a mystical vision of the special relationship between the Germanic people and their land. It was historically used as a tool to justify land seizures in Eastern Europe and the forced expulsion of local populations in favor of so-called ethnic Germans. The term was a rallying cry during the 1920s and early 30s, when the Nazis and other far-right political parties were in opposition to the fledgling Weimar democracy. So this is a moment we'll discuss a little bit about fascist symbols and philosophy, and look at how that's also applying to the policing of public space by far-right groups and actors. So let's go. So starting with fascism and where fascism also kind of gets its name from, the fascists. Fascist is this this bundle of sticks with an axe sticking out. It comes from Roman Empire, actually, or was popularized under Roman Empire, and it first became iteration in fascist Italy. So besides it being an instrument of a weapon by the lictor in Roman Empire, who had the role of protecting bosses, higher ups, leaders, political power, and they had the authority to do capital punishment, so kill unwanted parts of society. And this leads me to talk a little bit about fascism in its philosophy and in its practice. So starting with philosophy, the way I understood, I've learned about fascism, is that philosophically, they have an idea that there is such a thing as an authentic society. So while on the individual level, authenticity is often praised as a good thing, like to be authentic means you're not posing, you're not faking. But what does that mean if you apply that to a body of the nation or body of the people? It means that you have to constantly purge yourself from anything that's not considered authentic. So on the other side of the spectrum, philosophically, are groups like communist, socialist, and sometimes anarchist, which come from conflict theory, which understands that society is comprised of many different people, many different positions, and that are also in conflict. And it's messy and it's contradictory, and there's room for multiple elements. Whereas in this philosophy of authenticity, there is an essence, and that essence needs to be maintained. And if it's diluted, if it's polluted, then the nation withers, then we're no longer pure. And so it often uses the language of purification and addressing the pest, or what is seen as the pollution that needs to be purged, which is the outsider, which is anybody that doesn't have an able body, has different political stances. And so fascism will often first address communists and then people they see racially or ideologically different than themselves, not belonging to this essence of a particular soil that is connected with a particular blood. So this is a small introductions of fascism and blood and soil. Blah, 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 blah. What did I say? Anti-fascism is split, multiple, inconsistent, dynamic, and messy. Fascism, unified, singular, authentic. There's a particular principle of death and something that is supposed to be transcendent, like you being of a certain nationality is more important of your class. Your nationality is more important than individual character traits that you might have. Also within the ethics, you see that since there's such a glorification of violence and death, there's a demand for sacrifice, a demand for a certain submission to a Führer or a Führer-like strongman. And there is the political project of cleansing the nation, cleansing the society. So how does that translate to public space and environmental segregation? So we'll first look at Germany, where we see that in Nazi Germany, Jews were banned from driving on the roads of the nation, of the new highways that were made. So this was in the midst of Autobahn fetishizing. There was a booming car culture, and we saw that Jews were banned from the highway because they were seen as the outsider. In USA, car use in the early 20th century grew from 3.5 vehicles per thousand in 1909 to 219 to 1,000 in 1929. So just in 20 years. So even though it was still a small group of people who were driving, the early manufacturers stipulated that their motor cars must not be sold to blacks, even if they had the money. As one car journal noted in the 1920s, illiterate, immigrant, and N-words and other families remained outside of the market. So this is an early example of how fascism and fossil fueled private owned vehicles interfaced in politics in banning and exclusion. A book I read last year has really brought into my attention how cars are used as weapon these days after many Black Lives Matters protests, and also recently with climate protests. So let's take a look. Has anybody seen this news story at some point or know who this woman is? She and her daughter, who's sitting next to her, drove into a Black Lives Matter protest that was blocking the street. You can see some phone footage here on the right. So the headline of this story ran, New York woman who drove through Black Lives Matter protest refuses to plead guilty. So as it was obvious that she drove through the Black Lives Matter protest because there was video footage. It was obvious because she said she did it because she felt intimidated, and if she defended herself, she pleaded self-defense. Still, she refused to plead guilty. So there is a certain denial as a narrative of self-defense relying on racist sympathies that immediately cast both people of color and activists as dangerous, suspicious, and threatening. And I want to examine here the logic of denial and how it operates in discourse of the extreme right and racism in general, both in violence against people of color, but also in the context of climate breakdown. So this is another example of a headline of denial. Bolsonaro denies Brazil is burning, blames indigenous people for fires in disturbing speech at UNGA. So there's a particular assertion that first denies violence taking place and then blames the oppressed. Bolsonaro, again, he's a figure that has publicly praised the genocide of indigenous people in the US, saying that they did a better job of eradicating indigenous people. And he also publicly said many times that Brazil shouldn't have 1 centimeter, and later he corrected 1 millimeter of land rights for indigenous people. So, yeah, just as a context. This is not an isolated incident. This article the Wall Street Journal looks at cars have hit protesters more than 100 times this year. This was after the protest of Black Lives Matter in 2020. Only 39 drivers have been charged. So how does the law look upon these vigilantes that operate cars as weapons against perceived threats to their white nation, their white supremacy ideology? So first off, it's important to note that in these court cases, white supremacy crimes have been masked as self-defense, and law is being skewed and biased and distorted toward white supremacy and a status quo of white supremacy settler colonialism. So in Iowa, there was a white man driving into a protest, and he was let off the hook. No jail, and the incident was erased from his record if he showed good behavior. In Oklahoma, there was a law to protect those driving into protesters, which is absolutely absurd. And in Wisconsin, Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old, joined armed militia to show up at the Black Lives Matter protest on the side of the police, killed 2 protesters, shot at a medic who was wounded but survived. And at the trial, the judge forbade the murdered people to be called victims, whilst allowing the lawyer of the shooter to call the anti-racist protesters arsonists and looters. So we see here that the violence of the extreme center and law, once again, has a certain leeway of facilitating white supremacy culture. In this case, the police chatted and thanked the armed militia earlier that night and brought them bottled water. After the shooting, they let Kyle walk, even though witnesses all pointed out he was the murderer. Kyle turned himself in a few hours later. The extreme right has made him into their hero. Here we have one more example of how a distasteful politician and law are skewed towards normalizing, even standardizing racist violence, rhetoric, and practice. In effect, making the public space environment dangerous for anti-racism people to be in. So this is in South Dakota. A legislator, a white woman, was not reprimanded for her social media post saying, "I think this is a movement we can all support, hashtag all lives platter." So this was a movement that drove into anti-racists on the road. These are all important examples to show how our anti-oppression struggle is not against a few rotten apples in the aftermath of George Floyd, who went on to become famous the year after 1,068 police killings were gone on record in the US alone. And it is, maybe a good point to reflect on how cars can be weapons to bolster feelings of superiority in public space. And this has been known to people of color, but as we shall see, is also now happening to people defending environment. So one of the ways that cars are harnessed as a weapon is by rolling coal by entitled people. They drive diesel trucks and on purpose make big fumes of black coal and drive by bikers or people in electric cars or to bully them on the road. Also, another historical context of the US that this is not new. The whole way of environmental segregation in the cityscape is something that has a long history, not just decades, but centuries, of where people were allocated that they could live in the sense of Black people, certain policing in the sense of Indigenous people with reservations, and really the idea or the politics that people of color didn't own space and were living in an architecture or a map of a politics of a white supremacy culture, which was with the Second World War also having its effect in the US context because of the war effort in the final few years. There was a critical shortage of rubber in the USA, critical from anything for tanks to gas masks. So the material of rubber and also fossil fuels were rationed and reserved for military purpose, meaning less tires for domestic use. And actually the car to people ratio dropped in the Second World War time from 262 to 222 per thousand. And that was actually the largest drop ever recorded in US history. So the masses had to use public transport. They were pushed back into trolleys and buses. And we saw that Black people, 500,000 Black migrants, relied on public transport to get to the factories in Detroit. This is now taking us to the example of Detroit. And white people were reacting from a racist sentiment of not wanting to travel with Black people. So Detroit was a northern city, so there were no Jim Crow laws. And so it was practically possible for them to travel on the same bus, but many whites resented it violently. So there was a spike of racial disturbances on public transport, and the police received dozen reports a week, with real figures actually probably being a lot higher. So what would happen is a white passenger would imagine that a Black passenger brushed against them and throw out racial slur. There would be a fight over a vacant chair and who could have it, and would escalate the conflict into a stabbing. The sight of Black personnel driving the bus would provoke outrage, and white folks would say, "I don't ride with an N-word." In June 1943, the race riots turned into a 2-day killing spree. Mobs stormed trolleys and cut the wires, dragged out Black passengers, beat or stabbed them, and drove their cars to trolley stops and shot those waiting. In total, 25 Black people died, 17 actually by the hands of police. Also, 9 white people died, none by police. After the Second World War, there was a huge opportunity to build on the practice of public transport, but white car owners rushed to their car, tore up their ration coupons, and hollered, "Fill her up," eager to get into isolated car space where they were able to segregate away from Black community. And fresh into Peace Congress, there was an authorization for 37,000 miles of new highways after Second World War. So also note that people have known about the broeikaseffect effect, the global warming effect of fossil fuel greenhouse gases since 1896 in science with Arrhenius. And this is already pretty much 40, 50 years after when fossil fuels took a huge spike. Both the First World War and the Second World War have really anchored in fossil fuel in infrastructure, because there's been huge public spending in the infrastructure during the war effort, and then after the war effort, a privatization of the new technology or the new infrastructure that was made with public money. So this leads us up to date to how cars are now actually also more and more used as a angry way of attacking climate activists in Berlin. In Berlin, police said that in 2023, they opened 66 investigations into motorists suspected of committing crimes against members of the activist group Last Generation in the first 5 months. And last week, or the 1st of October, there was an article about how at the A12, extreme rechts was showing up to intimidate climate activists, and I believe also with a particular day of queer solidarity. So this was a little bit about blood and soil, and how environment has always been policed with white supremacy culture, and how cars have been a political tool for actually creating segregation. And in the case of the United States, also how cars actually also can become vehicles, not just of getting us from A to B, but actually sidelining the realities of other communities and other neighborhoods, because we don't really have to interact with them. We don't have to sit in a bus with them. And in that way, creating privatized little bubbles of privilege. So that was that, and I'll see you back in the next part where we'll talk about techno-racism at large, not just in car, but the bigger ideas of techno-racism. See you there.